Have you ever received a letter that felt less like a notice and more like a declaration of war? I have. It was a crisp, cream-colored envelope sitting innocently in my mailbox, bearing the imperious logo of the Lakewood Estates Homeowners Association. Inside, the language was cold, laced with the kind of legalese designed to intimidate. It informed me that my dock, a modest 8 by 10-foot wooden platform I'd built with my own hands, was in violation of community bylaws. It cited aesthetic incongruity and unapproved construction. The final paragraph was the real punch. I had 30 days to dismantle it completely or face escalating fines and a lawsuit to compel its removal at my expense. All this over a small dock I'd built so my 70-year-old father, with his 2 replaced knees, could sit comfortably and fish in the lake behind my house. It wasn't a monument to ego. It was an act of love. I'm Mark, by the way. I'm a software architect, which is a fancy way of saying I spend my days designing systems to find patterns in massive, chaotic datasets. I live for logic, for structure, for elegant solutions to complex problems. My life outside of work is intentionally simple. I bought this house for the quiet, for the view of the water, for the promise of peace. The HOA, led by its president, a retired car dealership owner named Arthur Peterson, seemed dedicated to destroying that peace. What they didn't know, what Peterson and his smug self-importance could never have conceived, was that they hadn't just picked a fight with a quiet homeowner. They had targeted a man whose entire career was built on turning mountains of incomprehensible data into actionable, decisive strategy. They thought they were sending a letter. In reality, they had just handed me a new project. Have you ever dealt with a petty tyrant who believes their small kingdom grants them absolute power? This story is for you. It's not just about how I fought back against their absurd demand. It's about how I used their own rulebook, a little-known piece of local history, and the analytical power of artificial intelligence to not just save my dock, but to fundamentally and permanently dismantle their authority over the very lake they claim to protect. They wanted my dock. By the time I was done, they'd be begging me for permission to even look at the water. My first instinct wasn't retaliation, it was reason. I believed, perhaps naively, that a simple conversation would resolve the matter. I prepared for the next monthly HOA board meeting like I was preparing for a project presentation. I put together a small folder containing the original permit I'd secured from the county, which, by the way, had no issue with the dock, along with a dozen photos. The pictures showed its modest scale, its sturdy and safe construction, and several heartwarming shots of my dad sitting in his fold-out chair, fishing rod in hand, beaming. I went to the meeting in the community clubhouse, folder in hand, ready for a rational discussion. When my turn came, I calmly presented my case. I explained the purpose of the dock, showed them it was smaller than many of the ostentatious patios attached to other homes, and offered to stain the wood any color they deemed more aesthetically congruous. I was polite, deferential, and accommodating. Mr. Peterson, sitting at the head of the table with the posture of a king holding court, didn't even bother to look at my photos. He let me finish, then steepled his fingers, a smug little smile playing on his lips. "Mr. Renshaw," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "your personal sentiments, while touching, are irrelevant. The bylaws are clear. The Architectural Review Committee, which I personally oversee, has deemed the structure an eyesore. Your offer to stain it is noted and rejected." The finality in his tone was absolute. He then announced to the room that my 30-day notice was now a 14-day notice, and the first fine of $500 had already been levied against my account. He was making an example of me. The message was clear. Compliance is mandatory. Reason is not an option. I walked out of that clubhouse, not with my tail between my legs, but with a cold, burning clarity. My project parameters had changed. The goal was no longer preserve the dock. The new goal was achieve total victory. That night, the frustration morphed into focus. I didn't get angry. I got to work. I took their 200-page book of covenants, conditions, and restrictions, along with every set of meeting minutes I could find on the HOA's clunky website, and scanned every single page. I fed the high-resolution images into an optical character recognition program, converting them into searchable text. Then, I fired up the development environment for a project I've been working on in my spare time. A custom-built AI language model I trained for parsing complex legal and contractual documents. I fed it every word of the HOA's existence. My peaceful lakeside home had just become a war room, and their precious rulebook was about to become their undoing. The first few nights were a blur of caffeine and code. My AI, which I'd nicknamed Justinian after the ancient Roman law codifier, began its work. It cross-referenced every bylaw with every amendment, flagging contradictions, procedural inconsistencies, and, most importantly, undefined terms. It was a digital bloodhound tearing through a forest of legalese. While Justinian analyzed the HOA's internal documents, I turned my attention outward to the public record. I started with the county plat maps for our subdivision, Lakewood Estates. I downloaded the digital deeds and survey charts, layering them over satellite imagery. Everything seemed straightforward at first. The property lines for each lakeside home, including mine, ran right up to a clearly marked boundary line that traced the edge of the water. The HOA's governing documents repeatedly stated that its jurisdiction extended to the boundaries of the Lakewood Estates development. This seemed like a dead end. Their power, it appeared, was legally defined and ironclad. But Justinian flagged something. The phrase boundaries of the development was defined by referencing the original plat map filed in 1978. It never explicitly mentioned the lake itself. It was a subtle omission, the kind of thing a human reader would gloss over, but a machine designed to spot anomalies wouldn't. This was the loose thread. I started pulling. My research went from the county's digital archives to their physical ones. I spent an afternoon in the dusty basement of the county records office, poring over older, hand-drawn maps from before the subdivision existed. I was tracing the genealogy of the land itself. And that's when I found it. That would change everything. The land that became Lakewood Estates was carved out of a much larger parcel owned by a timber company that went bankrupt in the 1920s. When the developer bought the land in the late 70s, he bought sections designated for residential plotting. The survey map from 1978 showed all the lots neatly drawn, but the lake bed itself was a blank space, an empty canvas inside the development's perimeter. It had a separate, older parcel number. I raced back home and cross-referenced that archaic number in the county's online tax database. The result hit me like a bolt of lightning. The parcel, officially designated as Lakewood Basin, Remnant 7B, was still technically owned by the long-defunct Arrowhead Timber Company. Because the company had been dissolved for nearly a century, no one had paid property taxes on this unusable parcel of submerged land. It was a ghost on the books, a forgotten piece of the puzzle. The HOA had been acting as if they owned or controlled the lake for 40 years. They'd been maintaining the fountain, policing the water, and now threatening me over my dock. But their authority, their entire kingdom, was built on a foundation of assumption. Their power stopped, quite literally, at the water's edge. They had no jurisdiction over the lake itself. And in that moment of discovery, a new, far more audacious plan began to form in my mind. The first iteration of my plan was simple: present my findings to the HOA and prove they had no legal ground to stand on. But that would only win the battle, not the war. Peterson and his board would simply rewrite the bylaws or find another way to harass me. A defensive victory wasn't enough. I needed a permanent solution, a strategic checkmate that would remove their power over the lake for good. The discovery about Remnant Parcel 7B wasn't just a shield, it was a sword. If the lake bed was an orphan parcel with a century of unpaid taxes, what was its legal status? I repurposed Justinian, feeding it state and county property law, specifically statutes regarding tax delinquent and abandoned land. The AI churned through decades of obscure legal precedents and presented me with a beautiful, terrifying option: a tax deed sale. Under state law, the county had the authority to seize and sell a property to recover delinquent taxes. In most cases, this happens via public auction. But for remnant parcels with a low assessed value and a long history of dormancy, there was a provision for a direct sale to an interested party who was willing to clear the entire tax debt. The back taxes on the lake bed, even with penalties and interest compounded over 90-plus years, were surprisingly manageable. The land had been assessed as non-buildable swampland in the 1920s, and its valuation had barely budged since. It was a pittance, less than the cost of the frivolous lawsuit the HOA was threatening me with. My strategy solidified, moving from defense to glorious, overwhelming offense. I wasn't just going to prove they didn't own the lake. I was going to buy it myself. I would become the legal sole proprietor of the Lakewood Estates lake bed. The implications were staggering. If I owned the lake, my dock would be untouchable. More than that, the HOA's beloved community beach, their pretentious fountain, and any access points they built would instantly become encroachments on my private property. They would be the trespassers. The irony was so rich, so poetic, I almost laughed out loud. While I was plotting this coup, their arrogance provided the perfect cover. I received another letter, this one from their high-priced law firm, a formal notice of pending litigation. It was filled with even more aggressive language. At the neighborhood mailbox, I saw Peterson holding court with a few other residents, gesturing dismissively toward my house and talking about how some people just have to learn the rules the hard way. He was so blinded by his petty power, so sure of his victory, that he never saw the tidal wave I was about to unleash. He thought he was playing checkers. I was designing a whole new board. This plan was too complex and had too many potential pitfalls for me to proceed entirely on my own. While Justinian was a master of legal theory, I needed a human expert to navigate the practicalities of the county bureaucracy. I found a real estate attorney named David Chun, a sharp, no-nonsense lawyer in his late 40s who specialized in complex property disputes. During our first meeting, I didn't even mention the HOA or the dock. I simply laid out my research, the original plat maps, the discovery of remnant parcel 7B, the tax delinquency records, and the state statutes Justinian had identified. I watched his face as he reviewed the documents. His initial expression was one of professional skepticism, which slowly morphed into curiosity, and finally, into a wide-eyed look of sheer astonishment. He got up from his desk, walked over to his own computer, and spent 10 minutes furiously clicking through the county's public records database. He turned back to me, shaking his head slightly. In 20 years of practicing law, he said, I have never seen anything like this. This is immaculate. Your research is flawless. He leaned back in his chair. So, you want to buy a lake? A slow grin spread across his face. I love it. Let's do it. David became my silent, crucial ally. He confirmed my strategy was legally sound and began preparing the formal application for the tax deed sale. The process was arcane and required precise, sequential steps. We had to formally notify the last known owner, the defunct Arrowhead Timber Company, via a public notice. We had to submit a certified check to the county tax assessor for the full amount of the back taxes and penalties. The paperwork was immense, but David's firm handled it with quiet efficiency. Meanwhile, I had to maintain the illusion of a man on the defensive. I sent a formal, registered letter to the HOA, stating that I was disputing their fines and their authority in the matter, and that I was reserving all my legal rights. I paid the initial $500 fine, under protest, a legal maneuver, David advised. This was critical. It prevented them from filing for a simple lien against my property for non-payment, forcing them down the more expensive and complex route of a lawsuit they would have to file to enforce the removal of the dock. I was baiting the trap with my own money. Every smug email from Peterson, every condescending notice slipped under my door, only strengthened my resolve. They thought they were cornering me. In reality, they were marching lockstep into the precise legal predicament I was meticulously engineering for them. The next phase required a nerve-wracking level of patience. Once our application for the tax deed sale was filed and the back taxes were paid, the county posted a small notice in the classified section of the local newspaper. It was a legal requirement, announcing the pending sale of Parcel 7B to recover delinquent taxes and inviting any other potential claimants to come forward. This public notice period was set for 4 weeks. It was 4 weeks of pure, unadulterated anxiety. Every time the phone rang, I expected it to be a county official telling me some long-lost heir of the Arrowhead Timber Company had emerged from the woodwork. Every time I saw Peterson's car drive by, I imagined he'd somehow stumbled upon the notice and understood its implications. I started buying the local paper every single day, my eyes scanning the dense columns of the classifieds, just to see the notice there, hidden in plain sight among ads for used cars and estate sales. It was a tiny block of text that held the key to my entire strategy. To keep the HOA focused on the wrong thread, I continued the charade. I sent another letter drafted by David, formally requesting a complete record of the Architectural Review Committee's past decisions to look for inconsistent enforcement, a standard tactic in these disputes. It was a meaningless gesture, but it had the desired effect. The HOA's lawyer responded with a multi-page letter refusing the request, citing privacy concerns. They were wasting their time and money fighting a phantom legal battle, completely oblivious to the real one I was waging in the county records office. The tension ramped up when Peterson, emboldened by my seeming inaction, sent out a triumphant community-wide email. He spoke of the importance of vigorously upholding our shared community standards and assured residents that the unapproved construction on the lakefront was being dealt with through the proper legal channels. He was peacocking, preening for his subjects. Reading his self-congratulatory prose, I felt a surge of cold satisfaction. His arrogance was the most valuable asset I had. He was so certain of the map he was holding, he couldn't imagine that someone else was redrawing all the borders. The 4 weeks finally crawled to an end. David called me the morning after the notice period expired. "It's done," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. No other claims were filed. "The county is processing the deed. It will be officially recorded in your name by the end of the week. Congratulations, Mark. You own a lake." The final piece of the puzzle was the lawsuit. I knew it was coming. My deadline for removing the dock had long since passed, and my under-protest payments were a clear sign of defiance. I needed them to formalize their aggression. I needed them to sue me. It was the only way to get them into a room where the rules of evidence and jurisdiction trumped the bylaws of a petty kingdom. A week after David's call, just as he predicted, the doorbell rang. A process server stood on my porch and handed me a summons. The Lakewood Estates Homeowners Association was officially suing Mark Renshaw in county court. The suit demanded the immediate removal of the dock, payment of thousands of dollars in accumulated fines, and, the cherry on top, full reimbursement for their legal fees. I held the document in my hands and felt a profound sense of calm. It wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. They had just RSVP'd to their own public humiliation. I immediately forwarded a copy to David. His response was a single-line email. "The trap is sprung. Let's set the mediation date." We filed a simple, one-page response with the court, denying all claims but offering no detailed defense. We wanted them to come to the table brimming with confidence, certain they were about to steamroll a stubborn homeowner who had finally been dragged to justice. For the next few weeks, I did nothing. I left the dock exactly where it was. I saw my father out there fishing twice, and the sight filled me with a quiet strength. This was no longer just about a place for him to sit. It was about the principle of the thing. It was about proving that rules without legitimacy are just a pretext for bullying, and that bullies, no matter how powerful they seem, always have a weakness. It's almost always their own arrogance. The court mandated a pre-trial mediation session. This was the moment I had been planning for, the stage I had been setting since the day I first fired up Justinian. Peterson and the HOA board would be there. Their expensive lawyer would be there. They would all be there, walking into a conference room, armed with their bylaws and their bluster, completely unaware that I was holding a weapon that made their entire arsenal obsolete. I wasn't just bringing a lawyer to the meeting. I was bringing a new reality. The mediation was held in a sterile conference room at a neutral law firm downtown. The air was thick with tension and the smell of stale coffee. On one side of the long mahogany table sat Arthur Peterson, flanked by 2 other board members and their attorney, a man named Henderson, whose slicked back hair and $1,000 suit screamed overconfidence. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance, as if I were a naughty schoolboy about to receive a final, stern lecture before expulsion. On our side, it was just me and David. I was in a simple blazer. David was in a crisp but understated suit. We were calm, organized, and ready. Henderson began the session with a theatrical sigh, as if the whole affair was a colossal waste of his valuable time. He launched into a condescending monologue about the sanctity of community covenants, the importance of property values, and my flagrant and continued disregard for the rules that your neighbors have all agreed to live by. Peterson nodded along, a self-satisfied smirk plastered on his face. Henderson concluded his speech by sliding a settlement offer across the table. It was the same list of demands from a lawsuit. Remove the dock, pay over $10,000 in fines, and, the final insult, pay their law firm's fees, which now totaled an additional $15,000. Sign this, Mr. Renshaw, Henderson said smoothly, and we can make this all go away. Drag it out, and those numbers will only get bigger. David let the document sit there for a long moment. He didn't even look at it. He simply pushed it gently back across the table. We respectfully decline your offer, he said, his voice even and calm. But we do have a counter-proposal. First, however, we need to address a fundamental error in your entire premise. A point of jurisdiction, it was showtime. David reached into his leather briefcase and retrieved a single, thick document. He placed it firmly in the center of the table with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the silent room. It was the certified grant deed for Remnant Parcel 7B, complete with the official gold seal of the county. As of 3 weeks ago, David announced, his voice cutting through the smug atmosphere like a surgeon's scalpel. My client, Mr. Renshaw, is the legal and sole owner of the property upon which his dock is situated. In fact, he is the owner of the entire lake bed from shore to shore. Your HOA's authority, according to your own bylaws, ends at the platted property line, which is the water's edge. Therefore, you are suing my client for placing his own property on his own property. The silence that followed was the most satisfying sound I have ever heard. It was a dense, heavy vacuum where arrogance and power had been just moments before. Henderson, the slick lawyer, was the first to react. He snatched the deed off the table as if it were a venomous snake. His eyes, which had been full of condescending mirth, now widened in disbelief as he scanned the legal descriptions, the parcel numbers, the official stamps. His face lost its color. He looked from the document to me, then back to the document. He was a machine that had just been fed a line of code it could not compute. Peterson's transformation was even more dramatic. His smug smirk evaporated, replaced by a slack-jawed gape. His face cycled through a Rolodex of emotions, confusion, then anger as he started to bluster. This is absurd. You can't just... Before Henderson shot him a look that silenced him instantly. The two other board members just stared, their faces blank with shock, like they'd just been told the sky was now green. They were all adrift, their entire worldview capsized in a matter of seconds. But David wasn't finished. He let the reality of the deed sink in for another 10 seconds before delivering the final, crushing blow. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential, almost sympathetic tone. Furthermore, he said, since the lake is now private property, we must address the issue of trespassing. The community beach area, the large fountain you maintain in the center of the lake, and the very water your residents use for recreation are all located on Mr. Renshaw's land. He paused for effect. We are, of course, prepared to discuss leasing options to grant the community continued access. However, given the bad faith and harassment demonstrated by this frivolous lawsuit, I must advise my client that the rates for such a lease will be significant. And of course, we will be filing a motion for dismissal of your suit and seeking sanctions and full reimbursement of our own legal fees. The room was now a tomb. Their lawsuit was not only dead, it was absurd. Their position had inverted completely. They were no longer the enforcers. They were the encroachers. Henderson slowly folded the settlement offer he had presented with such bravado and slipped it back into his briefcase. He looked at Peterson, his expression a cold mask of fury and damage control. The power dynamic had not just been shifted, It had been utterly and irrevocably annihilated by a single, perfectly executed legal maneuver. They came to conquer my little patch of wood and water, and in doing so, they had lost their entire kingdom. The immediate aftermath was a chaotic scramble of whispered arguments on their side of the table. Henderson quickly advised his clients that their position was untenable, a beautiful legal euphemism for catastrophic. Within 24 hours. Their law firm filed a motion to withdraw their lawsuit with prejudice, meaning they could never file it again. The war was over. The news ripped through the community. The HOA was forced to send out an email, not the triumphant declaration of victory Peterson had envisioned, but a humiliating, jargon-filled retraction explaining the discovery of new information regarding property boundaries. It was a masterpiece of corporate speak that failed to hide the simple truth. Their president's personal vendetta had led them off a legal cliff. At an emergency board meeting a week later, which residents attended in unprecedented numbers, Peterson was subjected to a barrage of furious questions. He had no answers. He had exposed the entire community to massive liability and made them all look like fools. A vote of no confidence was called, and he was unceremoniously stripped of his presidency and his seat on the board. His reign of petty tyranny was over. I became something of a local legend, a title I never wanted. People would give me a thumbs up as I checked my mail, but I had no interest in becoming the new tyrant of the lake. That would make me no better than Peterson. My goal was peace, not power. After consulting with David, I drafted a simple one-page lake use agreement. I sent a copy to every single homeowner in the association. The agreement granted perpetual, unimpeded access to the lake and the beach for all residents and their guests for a fee of $1 per year per household. The agreement stipulated that all fees collected would be donated directly to a local youth fishing program. My only condition was that the HOA as a corporate entity was explicitly barred from having any say, rule, or authority over the lake, its surface, or the land beneath it. They had to formally amend their bylaws to reflect this. They agreed without a fight. My doc stayed. My father, who had watched the whole saga with a quiet, worried pride, was back in his favorite chair that weekend, his line in the water. Looking at him, I reflected on the bizarre journey I'd been on. It started with a threatening letter and ended with me owning a lake. It was a powerful lesson in how modern tools can unearth ancient truths. Justinian, my AI, hadn't created the loophole. It had simply illuminated a fact that had been lying dormant for a century, waiting for someone to look. This whole ordeal taught me that the best way to deal with a bully isn't to stand up to them on their terms, but to change the very ground they stand on. Arrogance creates blind spots, and in those blind spots, a strategic mind can find all the leverage it needs. The world is full of people who confuse their temporary authority with absolute power. Always remember to check the fine print, to question the premises, and never, ever underestimate the quiet guy with a laptop. What's the most creative solution you've ever found for a problem someone else thought was impossible? I'd love to hear your stories.